Hello, welcome to week 7 of biology from a distance. We're almost done. This is our last week of new stuff, and then we're just on to our projects. So I'm excited to go over some of these things with you. They're some of my favorite topics in biology, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what you guys learn from this, and I've really enjoyed to see what you've learned so far. So I'm not going to spend too much time on announcements because not much has changed. I have your to-do list. Make sure you are up to date. If you're running a little behind, do what you can to get your research done. That is your number one priority. Quizzes are always good too, just so I can see that you've finished everything. You've gotten that done. And then I recommend, if you haven't already done so, to start looking, especially this week, because next week this is going to be the main focus of looking at your species project guidelines and maybe starting a slideshow. So I'll probably post something else at the end of this week, Thursday or Friday, to get you started on that. And then next week, that is your main focus, is getting that project together. And then just some reminders if you haven't finished some of those things. And I've been seeing those come in gradually. I will be grading them as the time goes on. So I'm going to skip through some of these things. Like always, you have your class meeting schedule. Those will be open. And this week, your wellness tip of the week, starting, I think, today and tomorrow, especially Wednesday, Thursday, it's going to be really nice, like hot weather. So get outside, be active, have some fun. All right, getting into this week's topic. So let's look at our unit we're kind of squeezing into just a few weeks. Last week we talked about what role a species plays in their community. So I was really excited to see that everyone who took the quiz had a really good understanding of what a niche was and could give some examples. This week we're going to be looking at how a change or a disturbance in a community or in an ecosystem impacts the overall ecosystem. So going from there, I saw a lot of really great answers from your revised questions. I really liked reading those that had basically the idea of what we're looking at this week. So I'm going to read a couple of them. First one, if a species were to disappear from the ecosystem, the predators would also disappear and it would be catastrophic. So each species has their own responsibility in the community. It's so true. Everything is connected. So if one thing disappears, the other things also are affected by that. Related to that, when every species is doing their job, it allows others to do theirs. Perfect. Everything plays their own little role, and one little thing being removed can affect everything else. Everything keeps nature out of balance. That was really good. And then finally, this one kind of helps us get into our theme of the week. If one species dies, it throws everything off, including the environment. All of the species play an important role to keep everything stable. And this is such a fundamental truth in ecology and ecosystems. I think you guys can see that from what you've learned so far. So we're going to dive into some of the concepts that relate to this idea of keeping everything stable. We're going to see our favorite word, talking about biological stability again this week, homeostasis. So get back into that whole unifying part of life. So not only do all species play an important role, but we also want to consider some of the non-living aspects of an ecosystem. So this is a pretty fundamental concept of ecology, and you might have seen it before. We've talked about these words before with our root words. We have two types of ecosystem factors. We have the living factors, which is what we've mostly been focusing on. Those are both the living things and the interactions between them. So not just saying the fish in the ocean and the dolphins and the seaweed and the kelp. It's also the interactions between them. So what's going on in the food web? What are those predator and prey interactions happening? What are some competition, symbiosis relationships happening between those different living things? Those are all living, so those would be biotic, just bio meaning life factors. And then the non-living things, which you can think about some of those things that are important, are going to also play a part. So those are going to be abiotic, a meaning not, so non-living. So these are the physical aspects of the ecosystem. So you can kind of brainstorm what are some abiotic things. That would be like water, anything involving water, whether it's a feature of water, like a river, a lake, an ocean, or the other aspects like water in the atmosphere, rainfall, humidity, things like that. geology, so the soil, even though soil does have a lot of living parts in it, the minerals, nutrients, and things like that that are in the soil, as well as the geologic processes that are happening, erosion, you think about all those things, weathering, that are going on in the environment, are going to have a big factor on your ecosystem. And then kind of related to both these things, make this go away, the climate of your ecosystem. So basically what we're looking at this week is that everything is connected, right? So both those abiotic and biotic components are greatly connected. So this diagram here kind of shows all these different arrows of every single thing kind of connects to every other thing. So the two main things we'll look at this week with our question is, first, looking at more of the biological community of, if we take one species out of that community, how does that impact the rest of the ecosystem? And then the second topic we'll look at this week is how ecosystems recover after major disturbances. So kind of looking at a small change and how that can greatly impact things, and a large change and how ecosystems can still bounce back after that. So I am not going to show this video right now because I don't want to take up my video time, but I highly, highly recommend you go watch this. You might have seen it before. It's one of my favorite videos. It's honestly pretty inspiring because of the narrator is British, and it just kind of makes you feel special about how good the wolves did for this ecosystem. So go back and watch this. It's a great example of what I'm trying to teach you this week. With that, you're going to learn two key phrases that are both pretty closely related. They all kind of build off of this idea of your ecosystem being kind of like a structure. So if you think about your this word here, keystone, what they're referring to in this is this archway, kind of like this. So it's like a doorway archway, an early human civilization masterpiece. But what a keystone is it's this middle piece here that keeps it all together. And if you are to remove this keystone, everything else would fall. So when we talk about keystone species, this is talking about how many species have an important role, even more important than other living things, other species, that would have a large effect on the ecosystem. Meaning that if you take that one species away from the ecosystem, everything else would fall apart. And it can be something at any point in that food chain, trophic levels. But when we talk about that happening at the top of the food chain, or the tertiary consumer, top of the trophic level pyramid, that is when we get into trophic cascades. So if you watch this video back here about the wolves in Yellowstone, wolves would be a tertiary top of the pyramid consumer. And so what a trophic cascade is it's when one change at the top of that food chain trickles down like a cascading waterfall to create changes throughout the ecosystem, throughout the community, throughout the food web. So both of these terms are basically about the same thing, that changing one population, one species, can have a really great effect on the rest of the ecosystem. So if you would like to see some more examples of that, the wolves are a good one. You can watch this video. There's a couple different examples of not just things at the top of the food chain, but things lower down, and how everything kind of builds on each other and every piece is necessary. So this is what you'll focus on for part A of your research task. You'll be looking at how your species could possibly play a special role in the ecosystem and what it would look like if you removed it. Okay, before we get into the next topic, another thing that's really important to learn about in ecology, and I'm kind of going through this quickly, is population dynamics. So in your populations, if you were to think about populations reproducing and doing well, you could probably see a trend where they start to skyrocket in numbers. But what we'll pretty much always see in an ecosystem, in a population, is that it kind of keeps this steady level at one point, because there's things called limiting factors that prevent a population from growing out of control. So you can kind of see on this graph, they overshoot, and then they kind of mediate with different limiting factors, whether it's predators, food scarcity, anything like that, that keeps it around this steady level. This level that it can't really go past is called a carrying capacity. And unfortunately, we don't have a ton of time to go into all the nitty-gritty about that, but that is another important word that you might see in the future if you do more ecology work. So when you have these limiting factors, there are things like predators, disease, food scarcity or limited food, water, even sunlight, space. When you have these things, which are going to always be present in a population, weather, those things maintain that homeostasis. If you didn't have that balance, one species might be taking over and there wouldn't be a balanced ecosystem. When you have larger changes, what that's going to turn into is a disturbance. So this is the main topic of the second lesson this week is disturbances. So you could probably think of a lot of natural disturbances. Sometimes we call them natural disasters. Fires, blizzards, hurricanes, drought, tornado. These are going to greatly affect the ecosystems where they occur. And then you can also think, we've been talking about this quite a bit in the last few weeks, about human-caused disturbances, so anthropogenic. So development, you can think of in a forest, a road running through the middle of a forest where you drive through. You know, we drive on them all the time. That's pretty disturbing to an ecosystem. Invasive species, something that doesn't belong there, bringing other things that kill wildlife. That's going to be a disturbance. So all of these different things are disturbances, and they're going to have a larger impact. It's going to result in smaller populations or sometimes even wipe out an entire population for a species. It breaks up the homeostasis, so that balance is kind of set off. So, like always, in life, there's always, pretty much always, unless, you know, it doesn't survive, a way to get that balance back through homeostasis. So even though it's not one organism, you can think of the ecosystem as a big organism, balancing things back out, creating that homeostasis. This process of returning to the original state or becoming sometimes even better is called succession. It's one of my favorite things to think about. It's kind of the old-fashioned life always finds a way type of thing, where even if something really bad happens in a habitat, life pretty much will always find a way to come back and recover after that. This is typically going to be really good for an environment. So when you see that bounce back, this following environment that comes from it, or ecosystem that comes from it, is oftentimes stronger and does pretty well. It can also lead to new adaptations. So this is how adaptation happens, right? We were looking at all of these environmental changes and environmental shifts that led to adaptations of new traits. So overall, it can be a really good thing. You can go through some of these notes, and unfortunately, because of time, we don't have a lot of time to focus in on all the nitty-gritty of this, but I included some notes just for your sake. About both two types of succession, where you start with nothing. This is called primary succession. So this is when everything's wiped out. A really good example of this is Mount St. Helens erupting. The hot lava flow that came from that caused quite a devastating change on the ecosystem up at Mount St. Helens, which is right in our backyard up north. So that would have to kind of start from just rock and build up from there. Still happens though. If you go up to Mount St. Helens these days, there's lots of pretty flowers, some small shrubs and trees coming up from that site. And then secondary succession is more common, of what we'd see, especially in Oregon, this is where there is some soil, some vegetation, and you're going to kind of skip some of those early steps and get right to the bigger plants. So this would be like a forest fire. So if you are driving out in the forest, either towards the coast or towards Central Oregon, you see those burned down trees. You can see a lot of little young trees coming up, and it doesn't take that long for that to recover. I have a couple really great videos here. This one about Mount St. Helens, like I said, it's a great story. Every time I am up there, I think of this succession pattern happening, and it makes me feel pretty cool about how nature is. And then also about how fire can be a good thing for forests on the second video. So with all of this, we're going to be ending the unit in the year by thinking about how we can manage these large catastrophic changes. Sometimes they're not catastrophic, right? Sometimes fire can be good, but especially recently, right? Just earlier this year, 2020, we started with the Australian bushfires, and these kind of were out of control, and it was at a point where it was definitely not healthy, and populations of animals and plants were being devastated. and still are to this day. Some of you who are studying things like koalas are having a good chance of